The trial of Sean Diddy Combs has quickly become one of the most talked about legal battles in recent history, drawing attention not only because of the severe charges, but also because of the drama unfolding in the courtroom. From the very first moments, it was clear that this case would be anything but ordinary. It all started on May 5, 2025 with jury selection, a process that turned out to be far more complicated than anyone could have anticipated. Given Diddy's immense celebrity status, finding an impartial jury proved to be a monumental challenge. In fact, the selection process was delayed multiple times as the court wrestled with how much media coverage and public knowledge about the case had already shaped potential jurors' opinions. Several admitted to already having seen the controversial video of Diddy's violent altercation with his ex-girlfriend Cassie Ventura, which played a significant role in the proceedings. Jurors were asked pointed questions about their awareness of the allegations against him, and one even admitted that he believed Diddy could buy his way out of jail, highlighting the difficulty in finding unbiased jurors when someone of Diddy's stature was at the center of such a high-profile trial. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as the jury pool was questioned in detail about their familiarity with the key witnesses involved, such as Cassie Ventura, Diddy's ex, and other major figures like Michael B. Jordan and Kanye West. This spotlight on Diddy's relationships with the famous and powerful added layers of complexity to the selection process. It wasn't just about choosing jurors who were impartial, but also about how their potential biases might shape their views on the trial. But beyond the challenges of jury selection, there was something even more striking happening in the courtroom. Diddy's appearance. Gone was the usual smooth, stylish mogul who ruled the music industry with charisma and luxury. Instead, as he entered the courtroom, Diddy looked markedly different. With gray hair, a goatee, and dressed in a dark sweater over a white-collared shirt paired with khakis, his appearance was strikingly subdued. This change in his usual polished persona wasn't lost on those in attendance. Many speculated that his new, more vulnerable look was a result of the months he had spent in the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn, a stark contrast to the flamboyant mogul image we're used to seeing. Diddy, who had once radiated confidence and power, now seemed far more subdued, his nerves palpable as the trial got underway. His quiet admission to Judge Arun Subramanian that he was a little nervous was a rare moment of vulnerability. This admission, though brief, was telling his entire world was unraveling, and it was clear that the weight of the charges was finally sinking in. The jury selection was just the beginning of a much larger story, one that would slowly reveal a side of Diddy that many never imagined. As the case proceeded, the focus would quickly shift to the testimony from those closest to him, and more shocking details would begin to surface. But for now, all eyes were on the courtroom, as the foundation was laid for what could be the downfall of one of the most powerful men in the entertainment industry. What happened next would take the trial to new heights, as Diddy's defense team and the prosecution braced for what promised to be an explosive series of testimonies. As the jury selection concluded, the trial began to take shape, and it was clear that this would be a battle of words, not just evidence. All eyes were on the first significant witness, Cassie Ventura, who would provide the court with a deeply personal and emotional account of the alleged abuse she suffered during her tumultuous relationship with Diddy. Her testimony, starting on May 13, 2025, set the tone for what would be an intense and heart-wrenching chapter in this high-profile trial. Cassie, visibly pregnant, took the stand with composure, but an obvious sense of vulnerability. She was about to expose the darkness that had overshadowed much of her adult life. As she began recounting her relationship with Diddy, she described how it started innocently enough when she was signed to Bad Boy Records at just 19 years old. What seemed like a professional connection quickly morphed into something far more complicated and ultimately toxic. Cassie spoke of how Diddy's advances began subtly, but over time they grew more controlling and aggressive. What initially felt like a romantic relationship became a series of psychological, physical, and sexual abuses that she felt unable to escape. One of the most shocking revelations came when Cassie described the freak-offs, a term she used to describe the disturbing and sexually explicit encounters orchestrated by Diddy. These freak-offs were not spontaneous events, but according to Cassie, meticulously planned and executed sessions where Diddy allegedly forced her to engage with male escorts while he watched, directed, and even recorded the activities. Cassie's voice trembled as she recalled being coerced into these degrading acts, feeling trapped and powerless with no way to escape the man who controlled not only her career, but her personal life as well. Throughout her testimony, Cassie's emotional distress was evident. The court watched as she wiped away tears, visibly struggling to relive these moments of torment. Her hands often found their way to her pregnant belly, a silent reminder of the future she was now fighting to protect. Despite the personal toll it took on her, Cassie found the strength to reveal intimate details of the abuse she had endured. She described how Diddy's manipulation and control extended far beyond their personal interactions. He allegedly made her believe that she had no choice but to comply with his twisted demands, even if they made her feel worthless and degraded. The most powerful part of Cassie's testimony came when she revealed that she had settled a civil lawsuit against Diddy in November 2023 for $20 million just one day after filing. She explained that the reason she had decided to settle so quickly was not about the money, but because she simply couldn't carry the burden of the shame and guilt any longer. The emotional weight of her experience was clearly too much to bear, and speaking out even in this limited way felt like a necessary step in reclaiming her voice. Her decision to testify in court despite having settled was not just about seeking justice. It was about breaking free from the hold that Diddy had over her. Cassie's willingness to confront him in such a public forum sent shockwaves through the courtroom as it marked a pivotal moment in the trial. With each word, Cassie exposed a side of Diddy that the public had long been unaware of, a man whose charisma and success hid a darker, more dangerous side. But even as Cassie bravely laid out the details of her abuse, the defense was already preparing its counterarguments, which would soon take the trial in an entirely new direction. As Cassie Ventura's emotional and graphic testimony continued to unfold, the defense team led by Diddy's attorney, Mark Agnifilo, began to prepare their strategy to counter the heavy accusations that had been laid out. The prosecution had established a compelling narrative, but Diddy's defense was equally determined to prove that the case against him wasn't as straightforward as it appeared. With the stakes higher than ever, the courtroom atmosphere became even more charged as both sides geared up for a fierce legal battle. The defense's first line of attack was to undermine the credibility of Cassie Ventura. Agnifilo argued that Cassie, despite her emotional testimony, was not a helpless victim, but rather a woman who had willingly participated in these events and benefited from her relationship with Diddy. He suggested that the entire narrative painted by the prosecution was one of manipulation and exaggeration, with Cassie presenting herself as a victim, when in reality she had been complicit in these so-called freak-offs. The defense portrayed her as a strong woman who had the agency to walk away from the relationship at any time, claiming that Diddy was just a man in a complicated, sometimes toxic relationship, one that did not cross the line into criminality. The defense also tried to downplay the significance of the sexual encounters Cassie described, arguing that the relationships and activities were consensual part of a so-called lifestyle that both Diddy and Cassie had participated in. They painted the accusations as part of an ongoing saga of drama and jealousy, blaming the media's portrayal of their relationship for escalating the issue into something much larger than it really was. But the prosecution had already laid the groundwork with some damning evidence. The most significant of these pieces was the surveillance video from March 2016, which had been leaked to the media in 2024. The footage taken from the Intercontinental Hotel in Los Angeles showed Diddy physically assaulting Cassie in a hotel hallway, a video that corroborated much of Cassie's testimony. The video showed Diddy grabbing Cassie, shoving her to the ground, and violently kicking her. This footage became a pivotal point in the case, one that the defense struggled to address. During cross-examination, Agnifilo attempted to discredit the security guard Israel Flores, who had been one of the key witnesses to the incident. Flores had responded to a call about a woman in distress and had observed the aftermath of the hotel altercation. According to his testimony, Cassie had a visible purple bruise around her eye, confirming the severity of the assault. However, Agnifilo attacked Flores's testimony, pointing out that certain details were missing from his initial report. Flores, he argued, had failed to include key observations in his incident report, including Cassie's bruise and the presence of another man in the hotel room. Agnifilo tried to portray Flores as an unreliable witness, insinuating that he had been pressured to give a more damning account of the incident than what he had originally documented. But even with this attempt at discrediting the defense, was faced with the overwhelming reality of the surveillance footage, a piece of evidence that could not be disputed. The video clearly showed Diddy's violent actions, leaving little room for defense arguments that attempted to frame the situation as a mutual or consensual exchange. Diddy's attempt to explain his actions as a result of a toxic relationship and a heated argument was weak in comparison to the video evidence of physical abuse. As the trial progressed, the prosecution's strategy centered on showing the full extent of Diddy's control over Cassie's life, both professionally and personally. They highlighted her testimony about how Diddy manipulated her career, keeping her dependent on him by suppressing her music and limiting her opportunities. The prosecution painted a picture of Diddy as a man who used his power not just to control women emotionally, but to manipulate and destroy their professional ambitions to maintain dominance. While the defense tried to divert attention to the inconsistencies in the testimonies and even suggested that Diddy's behavior was a result of substance abuse, the weight of the evidence, especially the surveillance video, was becoming too much to ignore. The prosecution had built a strong case, and the trial had only just begun. As the court prepared for the next phase, with more witnesses expected to testify, the looming question remained: how would Diddy defend himself against these allegations, and would he take the stand himself to offer his side of the story? The tension continued to rise with each new development, adding fuel to the fire of what could become one of the most explosive celebrity trials in history. As the trial continued, the intensity of the courtroom drama only escalated. With each new revelation, the prosecution's case seemed to grow stronger, and Diddy's defense began to show signs of strain. The credibility of the key witnesses, particularly Cassie Ventura, had already put Diddy on the defensive, but the floodgates were about to open even wider. One of the most unsettling aspects of this trial was the growing number of women who began to come forward with their own accusations against the music mogul, further complicating his defense. By May 2025, more women had begun to speak out, revealing the depths of the alleged abuse they had suffered at the hands of Diddy. These accusers were not just limited to those who had testified in the past, but included new faces, some of whom were willing to come forward after hearing Cassie's brave and emotional testimony. As the trial unfolded, more bombshell lawsuits surfaced, bringing even more disturbing claims to light. One of the most significant new claims came from a former employee of Diddy's, Adria English. In a lawsuit filed in July 2024, she alleged that she had been coerced into sex trafficking at one of Diddy's infamous white parties held in East Hampton. English claimed that after being given drug-laced alcohol, she was forced into sexual acts with guests at the event. This particular lawsuit added another layer of complexity to the prosecution's argument that Diddy wasn't just a violent abuser, but had allegedly used his power to exploit women for his own satisfaction. The more victims that came forward, the more Diddy's once untouchable public persona seemed to unravel. In addition to English's claims, more women began to file lawsuits recounting tales of manipulation, violence, and coercion that spanned decades. These allegations painted a disturbing picture of a man who not only wielded power in the music industry, but allegedly used that power to control the women around him in the most egregious ways. From sexual assault to threats of violence and blackmail, Diddy's behavior seemed to reflect a systematic approach to keeping women under his control emotionally, physically, and professionally. As the number of accusers grew, so did the media attention. The press, once enamored with Diddy's image as a savvy businessman and hip-hop mogul, began to take a more critical look at his actions. His previous reputation as the bad boy of music now seemed eerily appropriate in light of the mounting allegations. Public opinion shifted dramatically as more people began to question how someone with such a powerful presence in the music industry could have gotten away with alleged abuse for so long. The most shocking part of the growing list of accusers was the revelation that some of the women were minors at the time of their alleged encounters with Diddy. These new allegations, some involving women as young as 14, added a new level of horror to the case. The prosecution wasted no time in drawing attention to the severity of these claims, knowing that the introduction of minor victims could drastically alter the public and legal perception of Diddy's actions. At the same time, the defense continued to argue that Diddy was simply a man caught up in a toxic, albeit complicated relationship with women who were capable and strong adults. The defense sought to downplay the abuse by portraying it as a series of consensual relationships gone wrong, often focusing on Diddy's alleged substance abuse problems during the incidents. But the more victims who testified, the harder it became for the defense to maintain this narrative. While Diddy's defense team tried to maintain that their client was a victim of false accusations and media sensationalism, it was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore the sheer volume of testimony and evidence stacking up against him. The list of accusers had reached a point where even the most ardent supporters of Diddy had to question his innocence. And as the public continued to watch the trial unfold, one question lingered in the air. Could Diddy escape these charges, or was his downfall inevitable? With more women coming forward and the evidence mounting, the trial was now more than just a legal battle. It had become a cultural reckoning, forcing the entertainment industry to reckon with the darker side of fame and power. The more details that emerged, the more Diddy's empire seemed to crumble, leaving many to wonder what would happen when the full truth was finally exposed. As the trial progressed into late May 2025, the air in the courtroom was thick with tension. The series of bombshell testimonies continued to rattle both Diddy's defense and his public image. With each passing day, more women stepped forward to recount their experiences with Diddy, experiences that only deepened the accusations against him and brought the once untouchable mogul closer to the edge of a potential life-altering sentence. What started as a legal battle between one victim, Cassie Ventura, and Diddy, soon spiraled into a full-blown reckoning involving numerous women and explosive allegations that painted a disturbing portrait of the music mogul's behavior. One of the most shocking moments of the trial came when the prosecution introduced testimony from a former assistant of Diddy's who had worked closely with him for several years. This assistant, who had remained anonymous until the trial revealed harrowing details of Diddy's private life, including accounts of emotional manipulation, verbal abuse, and incidents of physical aggression towards several women. According to the assistant's testimony, Diddy would often fly women to his private properties where they were subjected to the same freak-off activities that had been previously described by Cassie Ventura. The assistant, visibly shaken as they spoke, described seeing women in states of distress and fear as they were forced to partake in sexual activities under Diddy's watch. What was even more chilling was the claim that the assistant had witnessed Diddy repeatedly use threats and intimidation tactics to control the women. According to the assistant, anyone who refused Diddy's advances or tried to leave would face severe repercussions, such as losing their career opportunities or being publicly humiliated by him. The testimony painted a picture of a man who controlled not just his relationships, but the careers of the women around him. This new information landed like a bombshell, shifting the public narrative yet again. The assistant's revelations aligned with the growing chorus of accusers who described a pattern of abuse and exploitation. The most disturbing element was the claim that Diddy had cultivated an environment where women felt they had no escape, often trapped by his power and influence in the industry. Meanwhile, Diddy's defense team scrambled to adjust their strategy. The introduction of this new testimony added an extra layer of complexity, forcing them to defend not just Diddy's personal actions, but the systemic nature of the accusations. The defense continued to assert that many of these relationships were consensual, with Diddy's lawyers claiming that the women involved in these so-called freak-off events had voluntarily participated and received personal or professional benefits from their involvement with him. However, the growing weight of the testimonies and evidence had begun to have a profound effect on Diddy's supporters both inside and outside the courtroom. The accusations against him were no longer just rumors or isolated incidents. They were building into an undeniable narrative of power control and manipulation. Even some of Diddy's most loyal industry colleagues started to distance themselves from the mogul as the trial wore on. This wave of shifting allegiances marked a crucial turning point in the trial, one that threatened to undo years of work and success for Diddy. Outside the courtroom, the media frenzy surrounding the case was in full swing. With every new testimony, the public grew more engrossed, scrutinizing every detail. Celebrities and influencers began to weigh in on the trial, with many speaking out in support of the victims. The hashtag #JusticeForCassie began trending, reflecting a broader public sentiment that was no longer willing to ignore the dark undercurrents of the music industry. As the trial moved closer to its conclusion, the question of Diddy's future seemed increasingly uncertain. The mounting evidence, coupled with the emotional and powerful testimonies from victims and witnesses alike, created an image of a man who had used his influence and wealth to systematically abuse and control the women in his life. This growing public perception left Diddy facing not just legal consequences, but the potential collapse of his empire, an empire that had once been built on his talent, charisma, and business acumen. It was clear that the outcome of this trial would shape the future of the music industry. With the tide turning against him, Diddy's fate seemed to rest on the final moments of the trial. Would the jury find him guilty of the charges that had rocked the entertainment world, or would he escape with a defense that had been heavily challenged at every turn? As the trial entered its final stages in June 2025, the tension in the courtroom reached a fever pitch. With each passing day, the prosecution had successfully built a compelling case against Diddy, but his defense team was not going down without a fight. The stakes had never been higher. Diddy was facing a slew of serious charges, including racketeering, conspiracy, sex trafficking, and transportation for prostitution, which carried the very real possibility of a lifetime sentence. The relentless testimonies and evidence seemed to be closing in on him, but the defense still clung to its central argument. Diddy had not been a criminal, just a man caught in a storm of media sensationalism, bad decisions, and complex relationships. In a last-ditch effort to salvage his case, Diddy's defense team made one final bold move. They decided to bring in Diddy himself to testify on the stand, a strategy that, if successful, could shift the momentum of the trial and potentially sway the jury. This move, however, was risky. For a man who had spent the majority of his career curating a controlled image, stepping into the public eye to speak on these allegations was a dangerous gamble. But desperate times called for desperate measures. Diddy, appearing markedly thinner and more worn than his usual self, took the stand with his legal team by his side. His voice shaky, but determined, he denied all the charges laid against him vehemently, insisting that the relationships he had with the women in question were consensual. He claimed that the freak-offs described by Cassie Ventura and others were not forced, but part of a lifestyle of mutual agreement, one that was part of a consensual and open relationship dynamic. Diddy explained that any tension or violence in his relationships was part of the challenges he faced in his personal life, fueled by the pressures of fame, substance abuse, and an inability to control his emotions at times. He painted himself as a flawed individual, but not a criminal, someone who had made mistakes, but did not deserve to face life-altering charges. Throughout his testimony, Diddy's demeanor remained calm, but his voice cracked at times, revealing the strain of the ongoing legal battle. When asked about the abuse allegations, he expressed remorse, admitting that he regretted some of his actions, but continued to deny that he had ever coerced anyone into participating in any sexual acts against their will. His defense attorney, Mark Agnafilo, played up this narrative of personal responsibility, asking the jury to separate the accusations from the man they saw in the courtroom, insisting that while Diddy's actions may have been controversial, they did not cross the line into criminality. But the prosecution wasted no time dismantling Diddy's narrative. During cross-examination, they honed in on inconsistencies in his testimony and sought to expose the true nature of his manipulation. They confronted him with the video footage from the 2016 hotel assault, where Diddy could be seen violently pushing and kicking Cassie. The prosecution pointed out that the footage contradicted Diddy's claims of a toxic but loving relationship and served as undeniable proof of his violent tendencies. The prosecution also brought up the testimonies of other women, including the former assistant and Adria English, whose claims about forced sex trafficking at Diddy's parties remained unresolved. They hammered home the idea that Diddy was not just a man caught up in bad decisions, but someone who used his wealth and power to coerce and control. His own defense had inadvertently shown how Diddy treated women as disposable objects in his world of excess and control. As Diddy's testimony drew to a close, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. His previously smooth, confident persona seemed to be unraveling. He was no longer the powerful mogul whose name was synonymous with success in the music industry. Instead, he was a defendant struggling to maintain credibility as his empire and his life hung in the balance. The jurors, who had remained largely impassive throughout the trial, now appeared visibly engaged, their attention focused on every word he said. In the final hours of his testimony, Diddy attempted to shift the narrative once again by offering a public apology to those he had hurt. His words were careful and measured, but the apology was seen by many as too little too late. For some, it came across as an attempt at damage control, a last-minute plea for sympathy in the face of overwhelming evidence. Now it was up to the jury to decide whether Diddy's defense would be enough to protect him from a lifetime in prison, or if the weight of the testimony, evidence, and public outcry would finally bring justice to the women he had allegedly victimized. The trial was on the verge of reaching its climax, and with the testimonies laid out, the truth of Diddy's fate was now in the hands of the jury. As the courtroom awaited the closing arguments, The media buzzed with speculation over what might come next. Would Diddy's long career of musical triumphs and business success be enough to overcome the charges? Or had he finally reached the moment when his empire crumbled, taking him down with it? Only time would tell. As the final days of the trial drew near, the air in the courtroom was thick with anticipation. With Diddy's testimony concluded, and the prosecution having made its strongest case yet, the stage was set for the closing arguments. Both sides had played their hands, and now it was time for the jury to decide whether the music mogul would face the consequences of his alleged crimes or walk free from the most publicized trial in entertainment history. The prosecution, emboldened by the damning evidence they had presented, delivered a passionate closing argument. They emphasized the pattern of abuse, manipulation, and control that Diddy had allegedly exercised over his victims, particularly Cassie Ventura. They argued that the physical and emotional abuse described by the women in the trial was not an isolated series of incidents, but a calculated strategy employed by Diddy to maintain power over them. The prosecution stressed the consistency of the testimonies, pointing to the corroborated evidence from the 2016 hotel hallway assault video, the testimonies from former employees, and the chilling accounts of the freak-off events. They also brought attention to Diddy's own behavior during the trial. His nervous demeanor, his failed attempts to downplay the severity of the allegations, and his inconsistent statements. The prosecution argued that his apologies, offered only after the full extent of his actions had been laid bare, were nothing more than a last-ditch attempt at damage control. They asked the jury to look beyond his celebrity status and consider the overwhelming evidence that painted Diddy as a man who used his influence to commit heinous acts under the guise of a lifestyle. As the defense took its turn, the tone shifted dramatically. Diddy's legal team acknowledged that their client had made mistakes, but they argued that none of the actions presented in court constituted criminal behavior. They sought to frame Diddy as a flawed individual, someone who had engaged in toxic relationships, but was not a criminal. His defense lawyers pointed to Diddy's charitable works, his contributions to the music industry, and his overall impact on the culture, suggesting that these aspects of his life should weigh heavily in the jury's decision. Mark Agnifilo, the lead defense attorney, attempted to dismantle the prosecution's case by casting doubt on the credibility of key witnesses. He suggested that Cassie and the other accusers were simply motivated by financial gain, citing the civil lawsuits and settlements as evidence of their attempts to exploit Diddy's wealth. The defense also argued that the alleged freak-off parties were consensual and that the women involved, including Cassie, had freely participated in these activities. Diddy, they contended, was simply an unwitting participant in a culture that celebrated excess, and his actions, while distasteful, were not criminal. With both sides having made their arguments, the jury was left to deliberate. Outside the courtroom, the media frenzy reached a fever pitch. News outlets were filled with speculation over what the jury's decision would mean not only for Diddy, but for the music industry at large. The trial had exposed the dark side of fame, wealth, and power, and now it seemed like the scales of justice were teetering on the edge of a monumental decision. As the days passed, the courtroom remained on edge, with everyone involved waiting for the jury's verdict. Would Diddy's empire withstand the weight of these allegations, or would his fall from grace be as swift and unforgiving as his rise to power? The world was watching, and the tension was palpable. The future of the once revered mogul now rested in the hands of 12 jurors, and no one knew for certain how the story would end. The verdict, when it finally came, would change everything, not just for Diddy, but for the countless women who had shared their stories of abuse and exploitation. The trial had already shaken the foundation of the music industry, and the world was about to find out if justice would be served. The waiting period had dragged on, but on June 2025, after days of deliberation, the jury finally reached a verdict. As the courtroom buzzed with tension, the door to the jury room creaked open, and the foreman of the jury stood clutching the verdict in his hand. The room fell silent. Every eye was fixed on the judge, the attorneys, and of course Diddy, whose fate now rested in the hands of a dozen strangers. The judge, Aaron Subramanian, looked down at the document and then addressed the courtroom with a gravity that was impossible to ignore. He read aloud the jury's decision, and with each word, the fate of one of the most powerful figures in music history was sealed: the verdict guilty. Diddy's face, usually filled with confidence, was unreadable. For a split second, his body tensed as if he had been struck by a blow. Then he slumped in his chair. His hands trembled, and the color drained from his face. The courtroom erupted into a mix of shocked gasps and murmurs. His family members, seated in the back, appeared devastated, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and heartbreak. For the victims, however, the moment was bittersweet. Cassie Ventura, who had spent years trying to escape the trauma of her past relationship with Diddy, wiped away tears of relief and exhaustion. Her fight, along with the courage of the other women who had come forward, had finally resulted in justice. For years, these women had felt silenced, intimidated by Diddy's power, wealth, and influence. Now they had been heard. The guilty verdict was not just a blow to Diddy's career, it was a seismic shift in the entertainment world. The music industry, once built on the influence of figures like Diddy, now had to grapple with the dark truths that had been exposed in this trial. Allegations of abuse, sex trafficking, and manipulation had long been whispered behind closed doors, but now the public could no longer ignore them. As the sentencing phase began, the world awaited the punishment that Diddy would face. The prosecution recommended the maximum sentence for all charges, citing the severity of his crimes and the damage they had caused to his victims. The defense, of course, pushed for leniency, pleading that Diddy had made efforts to change his life, seeking therapy and rehabilitation in recent years. But the damage to Diddy's legacy had already been done. His brand, once synonymous with luxury, success, and cultural influence, was now tainted beyond repair. Brands that had partnered with him, including fashion labels and beverage companies, quickly severed ties. The once mighty Bad Boy Records, which had launched the careers of some of hip-hop's greatest stars, found itself in a state of turmoil, scrambling to distance itself from its founder's tarnished image. While Diddy's legal team continued to mount an appeal, the public reaction was overwhelming. Fans, colleagues, and celebrities who had once praised his business acumen and talent were now forced to confront the uglier side of his career. There were calls for accountability throughout the industry, with many demanding that the structures of power that had allowed such abuse to thrive be reformed. For Cassie and the other survivors who had come forward, the trial's outcome marked a crucial step toward healing. The victory in the courtroom was not just about Diddy's downfall. It was about showing the world that victims of abuse and exploitation could stand up and be heard. It sent a message to other powerful figures in the industry that their actions would no longer go unchecked. Yet for all the victories in the courtroom, the emotional toll of the trial was far from over. The trauma, the painful memories, and the scars left by years of abuse were not erased by a verdict. But as Cassie left the courtroom that day, one could see the weight of years of pain lifting, replaced by a sense of empowerment. The battle was far from over, but it was a pivotal moment in the fight for justice, a reminder that even the most powerful figures could be held accountable for their actions. As the trial concluded and the public's focus shifted to the aftermath, one thing remained clear. The music industry and perhaps society at large had reached a turning point. The question remained, would this be the beginning of a new era, one where survivors could stand up without fear, or just another moment in time that would eventually fade from memory? Only time would tell. As the dust began to settle after the shocking verdict, the ramifications of Diddy's conviction reached far beyond the courtroom. The case had revealed the ugly underbelly of the music industry, where power, influence, and wealth were often used as shields to protect the privileged from the consequences of their actions. But now, with Diddy facing legal repercussions, the floodgates had opened and a wave of reflection was sweeping through the entertainment world. The outpouring of support for the victims, particularly Cassie Ventura, was overwhelming. The media, which had often been complicit in turning a blind eye to the darker aspects of celebrity culture, was now forced to reckon with its role in perpetuating toxic narratives. Public figures who had once stayed silent began speaking out against the abuses of power in the industry, calling for greater transparency and accountability. In interviews, former associates of Diddy, including those from his inner circle, began to reveal their own uncomfortable experiences. Many spoke of the environment that had allowed such behavior to go unchecked for so long. "I've seen things that I wish I could forget," one former collaborator said anonymously. "But the culture of fear around him? It's real. And for years, no one said anything because everyone was too scared of what might happen to their careers if they did." The revelation of Diddy's abuses also sparked a broader conversation about the music industry's treatment of women and vulnerable individuals. It wasn't just Diddy's actions that were under scrutiny, but the systems that enabled his behavior. The case became a symbol for the countless other stories of exploitation and abuse that had remained hidden for years. Artists, managers, and other industry insiders began to speak up. revealing patterns of abuse and manipulation that had been normalized under the guise of showbiz. For Cassie and the other survivors, the journey was far from over. While the trial had resulted in a guilty verdict, the emotional and psychological scars they carried would take much longer to heal. But for the first time in their lives, they had been heard. Cassie, in particular, became a voice for those who had been silenced, encouraging others to come forward and share their own stories. Her strength in the face of adversity was an inspiration to many. Justice has been served, Cassie said in a statement after the verdict was announced. But this isn't just about me. It's about the countless women who have been silenced, threatened, and controlled by powerful men in the industry. We are not invisible anymore. We will not be silenced anymore. The wider public's reaction to the trial was a mix of shock, anger, and support. For many, Diddy's fall from grace symbolized the shifting dynamics in the entertainment world. His conviction sent a clear message that no one, not even the most powerful mogul in music, was untouchable. But it also highlighted the difficult journey ahead for survivors of abuse in the industry. The culture of silence and complicity that had protected figures like Diddy for so long would not be dismantled overnight. As the case continued to reverberate through the entertainment world, more and more voices joined the chorus calling for reform. Some pointed to the need for better safeguards to protect artists, particularly women, from exploitation. Others focused on the importance of mental health resources and support for survivors of abuse. And many asked the difficult question, how many more stories like Cassie's had yet to be uncovered? The next chapter in this saga was about rebuilding and healing. For some, the road to recovery was just beginning. For others, the trial had been the first step toward reclaiming their voices. The industry, which had once allowed such behavior to fester, was now facing the uncomfortable truth of its own complicity. As for Diddy, his legacy in the music world was irrevocably changed. No longer seen as the hip-hop mogul who had built an empire, he was now viewed by many as a cautionary tale. His once unassailable power was shattered, and the world was left questioning how a figure who had once been celebrated for his achievements had fallen so far from grace. But beyond the trial, beyond the courtroom drama, there was a larger movement taking shape, a movement that sought to reclaim the narrative and demand real change. Cassie's bravery had sparked something much bigger than one man's downfall. It was a call for accountability, for the voices of survivors to be heard, and for the structures that enabled abuse to be torn down. The story of Diddy's trial was not just about one man's fall, it was about an industry and a culture in desperate need of reform. And as more stories continued to surface, the question lingered, what would the future of the music industry look like in the wake of this seismic shift? The road ahead would be long, but the groundwork had been laid, and a new era of transparency, support, and accountability was beginning to take shape. As the legal proceedings wrapped up, Diddy's conviction became more than just a moment in history. It signified a new era in the music and entertainment industries, one where survivors of abuse were not just heard, but believed. It was a painful yet powerful reminder that the consequences of unchecked power could no longer be ignored. For many, this marked the beginning of a larger cultural shift, a shift toward transparency, accountability, and change. But despite the clarity of the verdict, the real work had just begun. The spotlight had been cast on Diddy's abuses, but the case raised fundamental questions about the systems and cultures that had allowed such behavior to thrive for so long. The question on everyone's mind was whether this case would become a one-off or whether it would spur lasting change in an industry built on fame, power, and influence. In the aftermath of the trial, survivors of abuse began to speak up in ways that had never been possible before. Women who had once been too afraid to share their stories found the courage to come forward, supported by the realization that they weren't alone. The voices of these survivors echoed through the halls of the entertainment world, demanding that things be different. This moment also forced a reckoning within the broader industry. Music executives, agents, and producers, who had long turned a blind eye to abusive behavior, now faced mounting pressure to answer for their complicity. The notion that these issues were just part of the business was no longer acceptable. And as victims and advocates fought for systemic reform, the public began to demand better from the people and companies that had profited from the exploitation and abuse of vulnerable individuals. The #MeToo movement, which had already been making waves across various industries, found new momentum in the wake of the Diddy trial. Celebrities and influencers from all walks of life began using their platforms to address the toxic culture that had long existed behind the glitz and glamour of Hollywood and the music industry. What had once been considered a private matter was now a public call for justice, and the spotlight on sexual harassment, abuse, and exploitation was more intense than ever. Music labels and talent agencies, once known for turning a blind eye to the darker side of celebrity culture, began implementing new measures to protect artists. They were forced to confront uncomfortable truths about how their power dynamics and business practices had enabled abusive figures like Diddy to operate with impunity. Anti-abuse initiatives, artist welfare programs, and mental health support systems started becoming more prominent in contracts and industry standards. For Cassie, the journey was not about seeking revenge, but about reclaiming her agency. Her testimony had given voice to not only her own suffering, but to the suffering of countless others who had been mistreated in the industry. As she continued to heal and grow, Cassie became an outspoken advocate for survivors of abuse, using her platform to educate, empower, and inspire others to speak out. Her resilience in the face of immense hardship was a beacon for other survivors, showing them that it was possible to break free from the cycle of abuse even when the system seemed stacked against them. But Cassie's fight was not just hers. It was a fight for the future of the industry. It was a fight for a culture where no one, regardless of their status or power, could hide behind their fame and wealth. As time passed, the music world began to feel the ripple effects of this trial. Many artists, especially women and people from marginalized communities, began to feel a sense of renewed hope. They could see that real change was possible. For the first time, the entertainment industry seemed poised to rewrite the rules and create a safer, more equitable space for everyone involved. Yet even as the industry began to evolve, some were left wondering, would the momentum continue, or would the world quickly forget the lessons learned in the wake of Diddy's trial? The answer was uncertain, but one thing was clear: this moment was one that could not and would not be ignored. The battle for justice, equality, and integrity in the industry was only just beginning, and the survivors of this dark chapter were leading the charge into a new era,